Now, one more time, the steps of respiration. First off, we start with ventilation, which is the process of breathing in and out, and the gases are going to flow by bulk flow. And then second stage is external respiration, where there's the exchange of gas at the level of the lungs, and the gases are going to diffuse across the different membranes. Third step is the transport of oxygen or carbon dioxide, and that is the function of the circulatory system, and again that happens through bulk flow of these gases. And then there is the internal respiration, which is the gas exchange that happens at the cellular level, and that occurs through diffusion. In the cell itself, there is cellular respiration, and that is going to utilize oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. So what are the different principles of ventilation? The whole process of ventilation has a lot to do with physics. Ventilation means that exchange of air that happens between the atmosphere and the alveoli. So the simple breathing of in and out, that is what ventilation is all about. And which means that there is flow of air, and flow is always going to be directly proportionate to the difference in pressure between the atmosphere and the pressure inside of the alveoli. It is inversely proportionate, though, to the resistance. So if you increase the resistance, for example, in bronchial asthma patients, there is contraction of the smooth muscles of the bronchi, and that increases resistance, which decreases the airflow. Now, what are the relationships required for ventilation? So there are different pressures. There is the atmospheric pressure and the pressure in the alveoli, known as the alveolar pressure. In order to inhale, the atmospheric pressure has to be higher than the alveolar pressure, and that will push the air into the lungs. While during exhalation, the alveolar pressure needs to be higher than the atmospheric pressure, and that is going to push air out of the lungs. Now, according to Boyles Law, this all happens according to Boyles Law, where the pressure is inversely proportionate to volume, meaning that if you do not change the amount of gas and you increase the volume of an organ, that is going to decrease the pressure inside of it. So I'll show you this example right here. You want to think of a syringe. When you pull on the syringe, you're increasing the volume on the inside, and that will decrease the pressure inside of that. So again, that inverse relationship between volume and pressure. And it's because of the decrease in pressure inside of the syringe that leads to the pulling of air towards the inside. And that would kind of represents what happens during inhalation. During exhalation, on the other hand, we are decreasing the size of the lungs, and that increases the pressure on the inside, which will lead to the flow of air towards the atmosphere. Okay, so these pressures and these pressure changes and volume changes do translate to the lungs. So you will see here that during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. Usually the diaphragm is a dome. That's what it looks like when it's relaxed. When it's contracted, it becomes flat. And you can see here that increases the volume of the lungs. Volume goes up, pressure in the lungs go down. Now the intraalveolar pressure is less than the atmospheric pressure, and that is going to lead to the air flowing from the area of higher pressure down to the area of lower pressure, and that's how inhalation happens. Now the opposite would happen during exhalation, where the diaphragm relaxes, becomes a dome again, decreasing the volume of the lungs. Since the volume went down, the pressure in the lungs will go up, and that is going to translate into the intraalveolar pressure becoming higher than the atmospheric pressure, and that will push the air out, leading to exhalation. Not only is exhalation due to the relaxation of the diaphragm, but there's also the elastic recoil of the alveoli. Now, what about how do we measure all of these different pressures? We measure the respiratory pressures relative to the atmospheric pressure. And the unit of pressure is usually either 1 atmosphere or 0 atmosphere, or in the we use the measurements millimeters of mercury. So at sea level, we consider that to be 1 atmosphere or 760 millimeters of mercury. When we go up to higher altitudes, that will lead to the decrease in pressure, and that actually makes it harder to breathe. Now there's other pressures beside the intraalveolar pressure that has a role during respiration. There is a transmural pressure, and a transmural pressure means pressure across a wall, which is basically the pressure difference between the pressure inside of the structure minus the pressure outside of that structure. So I'll give you, we'll take a look at these different pressures, and we'll get to that slide in a minute. So this right here represents the lungs with the elastic recoil, and we call that the alveolar pressure. There's also a pressure in between the two pleural, so between the visceral and the parietal pleural, and we call that the intrapleural pressure. And then there's a pressure on the outside in the atmosphere, and we call that the atmospheric pressure. So there are 3 different pressures here: alveolar pressure in the alveoli, intrapleural pressure between the visceral and parietal pleural layers, and then there's a pressure outside in the atmosphere. At the end of an unforced expiration, which is the end of a normal expiration, the pressure in the alveoli is equal to the atmospheric pressure, and they are both 0. While the pressure in the pleural sac, the intrapleural pressure, is negative. Now for the transmural pressures. Transmural pressure means, again, a pressure across a membrane or across a wall. So the pressure, transpulmonary pressure is the difference in pressure between the alveoli minus the intrapleural, and then the pressure of the chest wall is the intrapleural minus the atmosphere. What is happening at that point, at the end of an unforced expiration, 2 different things want to happen at the same time. There is the lungs that want to collapse due to the elastic recoil, and the chest wall has its own elastic recoil, but it's in the opposite direction, so it kind of wants to pop open. And these 2 opposite forces are preventing from doing so because of the pull of that negative pressure, negative intrapleural pressure. So let's go back to that slide. So the transpulmonary pressure, again, is the difference between the alveolar pressure minus the intrapleural pressure. And it opposes the inward elastic recoil of the lungs. So again, the lungs have are full of elastic tissue, and it's because of that elastic tissue that it would like to, the lungs have the tendency to collapse, but it's prevented from doing so because of that transpulmonary pressure. Now the chest wall pressure, that is the difference between the intrapleural and the atmospheric pressures, and this opposes the outward elastic recoil of the chest wall. So the chest wall basically wants to pop open, but it's preventing from doing so because of that chest wall transmural pressure. Now what happens if we break into one of these membranes? So you see here, there is a tear in the parietal pleural. Now air will go into the pleural space. That means that all 3 of those pressures, the alveolar, intrapleural, and the atmospheric pressures are all going to be equal, and they're all going to be equal to 0. Now we've lost that negative pressure that used to be in the pleural space, and that is going to allow now for the elastic recoil of the lung to happen, and you can see here that the lung collapses, and this is what is known as pneumothorax. So pneumothorax is the presence of air in the pleural cavity. So you'll see that lungs will collapse and the chest wall will become elevated, again, because of that outward elastic recoil and loss of the negative intrapleural pressure. Now, how do we inspire? How do we inhale? Well, there's a signal that goes from the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm, leading to its contraction. When the diaphragm contracts, it is going to increase the volume of the lungs. Volume goes up, pressure goes down. Now the intrapleural pressure, or the intraalveolar pressure, is less than the atmospheric pressure. That means that basically we're going to suck air into the lungs. Okay, that allows for the flow of air into the lungs. Normal inhalation happens by the contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. If we need to inhale deeply, we are going to use what are known as the accessory muscles of inhalation, and those are the pectoralis minor, the sternocleidomastoid muscle in the neck, and the muscles in the shorter muscles in the neck known as the scalene muscles. Now, what about the sequence of events during expiration? First off, the diaphragm and the external intercostals have to relax, and then there's the elastic recoil. Now, moving on to expiration, the diaphragm and the external intercostal relaxes, and more importantly, there's also the elastic recoil of the alveoli that increases the intraalveolar pressure above the atmospheric pressure. That's going to push air towards the atmosphere, so push air out of the lungs. And you can see here that under expiration at rest, that is due to, again, the relaxation of the diaphragm and external intercostals with the elastic recoil of the lungs. If a forceful expiration is needed, that will be performed by the accessory muscles of expiration, which are the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. And this ends this portion.